In Eleanor Hartwell's Victorian estate, Maya faced ultimate betrayal at her grandmother's funeral. What started as a final farewell took a shocking turn when Sister Victoria boldly claimed the entire inheritance with a seemingly legitimate will. Maya wasn't your typical art teacher. For years, she'd been Eleanor's devoted granddaughter, known for unwavering loyalty. When Victoria announced her inheritance, Maya had no idea she was witnessing calculated fraud. Her stunned reaction would spark a devastating legal war, exposing family secrets, destroying relationships, and revealing the true price of greed versus love. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The last of the mourners were filtering out through the front door when Maya noticed the headlights cutting through the October dusk. She stood at the living room window, still wearing the simple black dress she'd chosen that morning, one Eleanor had always complimented, and watched as an unfamiliar sedan pulled into the circular drive. The car moved slowly, deliberately, as if its occupant was uncertain about arriving. From the kitchen came the sound of Victoria's voice, sharp and businesslike as she spoke into her phone. "No, I need you here first thing Monday morning. The appraisal can't wait." "Yes, I understand it's short notice, but this is a significant estate." Maya's stomach churned at her sister's words. 3 hours after Eleanor's burial, Victoria was already treating their grandmother's home like a commodity. The car door opened, and Maya recognized the tall, slightly stooped figure of Henry Blackwood, even in the gathering darkness. Eleanor's lawyer moved with the careful precision of a man who'd learned not to trust his aging joints, but there was something urgent in his gait as he approached the house. In his right hand, he carried a weathered leather briefcase that Maya remembered from childhood visits to his office. "Henry's here," Maya called toward the kitchen, but Victoria's phone conversation continued unabated. Maya opened the front door before Henry could knock. His usually immaculate silver hair was disheveled, and his normally pristine suit bore the wrinkles of long travel. Behind wire-rimmed glasses, his pale blue eyes held an expression she'd never seen before, something between sorrow and barely contained anger. "Henry, my dear." His voice carried the weight of 30 years practicing law in a small town where everyone's business was known. "I came as soon as I could. I was in Boston dealing with the Morrison estate crisis when I got word about Eleanor. I'm so very sorry for your loss." "Thank you, Henry. She thought the world of you. You know that." His weathered hands tightened around the briefcase handle. "I need to speak with both you and Victoria. Immediately. It's about Eleanor's will." Maya felt something cold settle in her stomach. "But Victoria already has the—" "That's exactly what we need to discuss." Henry's voice carried an authority that commanded Vermont courtrooms for decades. "Is your sister available?" Victoria chose that moment to emerge from the kitchen, sliding her phone into her designer purse with the satisfied expression of someone who'd just concluded successful business. She'd changed from her funeral attire into a crisp, charcoal suit that made her look every inch the New York corporate lawyer she'd become. "Henry, I wasn't expecting you." Victoria's smile was perfectly calibrated, warm enough to seem appropriate, but not so warm to invite lengthy condolences. "Henry," Victoria's tone stopped her, mid-sentence. "We need to talk. All of us. Right now." Something in his voice made Victoria's confident demeanor flicker. Maya noticed the brief tightening around her eyes, the way her manicured fingers unconsciously smoothed her jacket. "Of course," Victoria said, recovering quickly, "though I should mention that I've already begun making arrangements based on grandmother's will, the one she left with David's firm for safekeeping. Everything seems quite straightforward." Henry said nothing, but Maya saw his jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. "Eleanor's study," he said simply. "We'll talk there." The study had always been Eleanor's sanctuary, a room that smelled of old leather and lavender sachets, where afternoon sunlight filtered through lace curtains onto towering bookshelves. Family photographs covered every available surface: Maya's school pictures, Victoria's law school graduation, their parents' wedding portrait. Eleanor's antique oak desk dominated the room, its surface now cleared except for a small vase of the chrysanthemums Maya had cut from the garden that morning. Henry settled into Eleanor's desk chair with the familiarity of an old friend, placing his briefcase on the polished wood surface. Victoria perched on the edge of the leather sofa, her posture suggesting she expected this to be a brief formality. Maya chose the window seat where she'd spent countless childhood afternoons listening to Eleanor's stories. "Victoria," Henry began, his voice carried the measured cadence of a man choosing his words carefully. "I need to see the will you've been referencing." Victoria's smile never wavered as she produced a manila folder from her purse. "Certainly. As you'll see, it's all quite standard. Eleanor left everything to me, with provisions for Maya, of course." Henry accepted the documents, pulling reading glasses from his jacket pocket with deliberate slowness. The only sounds in the room were the ticking of Eleanor's grandfather clock and the rustle of turning pages. Maya watched Henry's expression change as he read, saw his deepening lines around his eyes, the way his mouth pressed into a thin line. Finally, Henry removed his glasses and looked directly at Victoria. "Where did you obtain this document?" "From David's safe, obviously. Eleanor gave it to him for safekeeping last month when she came to New York." Victoria's voice held just the right note of confusion, as if Henry's question was puzzling but insignificant. "I see." Henry opened his briefcase with deliberate care. "That's very interesting, because 3 days ago I helped Eleanor update her actual will, the real one, which is currently in her safe deposit box at First National Bank, where it's been since she signed it in my presence on October 15th. The color drained from Victoria's face. Maya felt the room tilt slightly, as if the foundation of everything she thought she knew was shifting beneath her. Henry withdrew a document from his briefcase, its crisp white pages bearing official seals and ribbons. "This is Eleanor's authentic last will and testament. The document you've been showing everyone is an elaborate forgery." Victoria was on her feet instantly, her composure cracking like ice in spring. "That's impossible! You're mistaken or confused or—" "Victoria," Henry's voice cut through her protests with quiet authority. "I've been practicing law for 43 years. I know my own work." He turned to Maya, his expression softening. "Eleanor left the estate, the business, and the majority of her assets to you, Maya. Everything. She included a detailed letter explaining her reasoning, which I'm authorized to read to both of you." My hands were shaking. "I don't understand. Why would she—" "Because Eleanor was no fool," Henry said gently. "She saw what was happening. She knew." Victoria's mask finally slipped completely, revealing something raw and desperate underneath. "You senile old man, you don't know what you're talking about. That will is fake, forged. I'll have your license." "The paper stock on your document doesn't match what I use. The watermark is wrong. The notary seal is from someone who retired 5 years ago. And most importantly, Eleanor never would have chosen your husband's law firm for something this significant when she had her own attorney of 30 years. The grandfather clock chimed 7 times, its deep notes seeming to echo the finality of Henry's words. Maya stared at her sister, seeing a stranger where Victoria had always been. The perfectly composed corporate lawyer was gone, replaced by someone whose desperation was palpable. "You're going to contest this," Victoria said, her voice low and dangerous. "You're going to drag this family through hell, aren't you?" Henry carefully returned Eleanor's real will to his briefcase. Victoria, you've committed fraud. Document forgery is a serious crime. What happens next depends entirely on what you do now. Maya finally found her voice. Victoria, how could you? At grandmother's funeral of all times? But Victoria was already moving toward the door, her heels clicking sharply on the hardwood floor. This isn't over, she said without turning around. Not even close. The front door slammed with enough force to rattle the windows. Through the study's lace curtains, Maya watched her sister's rental car disappear into the darkness, its taillights fading like dying embers. Henry reached across the desk and gently touched Maya's hand. I'm sorry you had to learn about your sister this way. Eleanor hoped it wouldn't come to this. Maya looked around the room filled with family memories, feeling as if She found herself drawn to Eleanor's bedroom, a space she'd avoided during the funeral preparations. The room still smelled like her grandmother's lavender water and the peppermint tea she'd sipped before bed. Maya sat on the edge of the four-poster bed where Eleanor had died peacefully in her sleep just 5 days ago, though it felt like a lifetime. On the nightstand, Eleanor's reading glasses rested atop a book of poetry, a ribbon bookmark marking a page about halfway through. Maya opened it to find a poem by Mary Oliver about the wild geese, about belonging and finding one's place in the world. In the margins, Eleanor had written in her careful script, For Maya, you've always known where you belong. Tears came then, the first real tears since Henry's revelation had turned grief into something more complicated. Maya wept for Eleanor, for the sister she thought she'd known, for the family that had just shattered beyond recognition. When the tears finally stopped, Maya found herself moving through Eleanor's private spaces with new eyes. The escritoire in the corner held neat stacks of correspondence, and Maya began to read, looking for clues she'd list, signs of the storm that had been building. The letters painted a picture of a woman far more aware than anyone had realized. Eleanor's correspondence with Henry revealed growing concern about Victoria's behavior during her infrequent visits. She asks too many questions about finances and not enough about how I'm feeling, Eleanor had written in April. Another letter, dated just 6 weeks ago, was more direct. I fear Victoria sees me as an obstacle rather than a grandmother. But it was the final letter, dated just 2 weeks before Eleanor's death, that made Maya's hands shake. Henry, I need to see you immediately about changing my will. Victoria came by yesterday asking pointed questions about my accounts and where I keep important papers. When I mentioned that my will was with your office, I saw something in her eyes that frightened me. I may be old, but I'm not naive. Please call as soon as you receive this. Maya sank into Eleanor's reading chair, the letter trembling in her hands. Eleanor had known. She'd seen through Victoria's charm and manipulation, had recognized the danger, and had acted to protect the family legacy. The real tragedy wasn't just Victoria's betrayal, it was that Eleanor had died knowing what her older granddaughter was capable of. The house phone rang, startling Maya from her dark thoughts. Marcus Chen's familiar voice was warm with concern. Maya, I know it's late, but I saw the lights still on. How are you holding up? Maya almost laughed at the inadequacy of the question. How was she holding up? Her sister had committed fraud, her family had disintegrated, and she'd inherited responsibilities she'd never wanted, along with secrets she'd never suspected. Marcus, Can you come over, please? I need to tell someone what happened, and I need it to be someone I trust. I'll be right there. Within 10 minutes, Maya heard Marcus's truck in the driveway. She met him at the door, and the sight of his concerned face, familiar and honest and reassuring, nearly broke her composure again. What happened after I left? He asked, following her into the kitchen where she automatically began making tea the way Eleanor had taught her. Maya told him everything, from Victoria's forged will to Henry's dramatic revelation to David's uncomfortable admissions about their financial situation. Marcus listened without interruption, his journalist instincts cataloging details even as his friend's heart ached for her pain. Jesus, Maya. Victoria actually forged a will? That's not just family drama, that's felony's fraud. I know. Maya set 2 steaming mugs on Eleanor's kitchen table, and I don't know what to do about it. Part of me wants to turn her in, let her face the consequences, but part of me still loves your sister despite everything she's done. Maya nodded, grateful that Marcus understood without her having to explain. Eleanor wouldn't want me to destroy what's left of our family, even for justice. But I can't let Victoria get away with this either. Marcus reached across the table and covered her hand with his. You don't have to decide everything tonight. Right now, you need to grieve and process and figure out what Eleanor really wanted you to do with this inheritance. I never wanted it, Maya said quietly. The responsibility, the business, any of it. I just wanted Eleanor. I know, but maybe that's exactly why she chose you. Outside, autumn wind rattled the windows of the house that was now Maya's, carrying with it the promise of a long winter ahead. In the morning, she would have to begin the work of understanding her inheritance and preparing for Victoria's inevitable counterattack. But tonight, she sat with her oldest friend in Eleanor's kitchen, drinking tea and trying to make sense of a world that had changed completely in the space of a few terrible hours. The battle for Eleanor's legacy was just beginning. Maya woke the next morning to find Marcus in Eleanor's kitchen, quietly making breakfast while scanning something on his laptop. Sunlight streamed through the lace curtains, making everything look deceptively normal, as if the events of the previous evening had been nothing more than a nightmare born from grief. Marcus? He said, turning the laptop toward her. What are you reading? Background research, old journalism habits. Marcus's law firm has been in the news recently. 3 partners were investigated last year for client trust fund irregularities. Nothing was proven, but the rumors have been affecting their reputation. Maya studied the screen, recognizing none of the names except Victoria's in the firm's directory. You think that's connected to her financial problems? Maybe. Partnership in a firm under scrutiny comes with pressure to bring in clients, prove your worth. That costs money. Entertainment, wardrobe, the right address. Marcus closed the laptop. But we need more than speculation. We need facts. Where do we start? With the people who knew Eleanor best. Who would have seen Victoria's behavior change, notice things that seemed off? Marcus pulled out a notebook, old-fashioned paper, not a phone app, which made Maya smile despite everything. Henry mentioned that Eleanor's neighbor, Janet Morrison, has been paying attention. Want to start there? An hour later, they walked the short path through Eleanor's garden to the Morrison property, a well-maintained colonial that had been Janet's home for 2 decades. Maya had known Janet peripherally. She'd been Eleanor's friend, the neighbor who checked in during storms and accepted deliveries when Eleanor was out. But she'd never really considered how much she might have observed. Janet answered the door in gardening clothes, her graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. Her eyes were red-rimmed, and Maya realized she was probably the only person in town who'd grieved Eleanor as deeply as family might. Maya, honey, how are you holding up? Janet's embrace smelled of earth and roses. I've been worried about you since yesterday. We're managing. Janet, this is Marcus Chen. He runs the newspaper now. I remember you, Janet said, studying Marcus with sharp eyes. You wrote that lovely piece about Eleanor's antique business last spring. She was so proud of that article. They settled in Janet's living room, which had a clear view of Eleanor's property through wide windows. Janet served coffee from a pot that looked like it had been brewing since dawn. And Maya realized this was a woman who was expecting them. You want to know about Victoria, Janet said before Maya could form the question. About why I wasn't surprised when Eleanor asked me to be extra watchful these past few months. Maya leaned forward. Eleanor asked you to watch for something specific? That's how I understood it. But Eleanor was too sharp for that. She thanked Victoria for her concern and said she'd discuss it with Henry before making any decisions. Janet smiled grimly. Victoria wasn't happy about that response. What did she do? Argued, pushed, said Henry was too old to handle complex estate planning, that Eleanor needed a firm with more resources. Janet stood and moved to the window. That's when I started paying closer attention. Eleanor asked me to note the dates and times of Victoria's visits, anything unusual about her behavior. Marcus leaned forward. Do you still have those notes? Janet nodded, disappearing into another room. She returned with a small spiral notebook, its pages filled with careful handwriting. Eleanor was very specific about what she wanted documented. She said if anything happened to her, these observations might be important. Maya took the notebook with shaking hands. Janet's neat script recorded not just dates and times, but details that painted a disturbing picture. Victoria arriving with documents already prepared. Her impatience when Eleanor wanted time to consider decisions. The way she'd grown angry when Eleanor mentioned consulting Henry. The last entry is from 3 weeks ago, Janet said quietly. Victoria came by on a Wednesday afternoon, which was unusual. She normally visited weekends. She seemed agitated, kept checking her phone. Eleanor later told me Victoria had asked again about where she kept her will and seemed frustrated when Eleanor said it was safely stored with Henry. Marcus was studying the notebook entries. Janet, would you be willing to testify to these observations if it became necessary? You mean in court? Janet looked between Maya and Marcus, her expression troubled. Is that what this is leading to? Maya took a deep breath. Victoria presented a forged will at the funeral yesterday. She's been planning this for months. Janet's face went through several emotions before settling on determination. Then yes, absolutely. Eleanor was like a sister to me. If Victoria thinks she can dishonor Eleanor's memory with lies and fraud, she's going to find out what this community thinks of people who prey on the elderly. They spent another hour going through Janet's observations, building a timeline of Victoria's increasingly desperate behavior. When they finally left, Maya felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. This wasn't just about an inheritance anymore. It was about protecting Eleanor's reputation and ensuring that predatory behavior didn't go unpunished. Where to next? Marcus asked as they walked back toward Eleanor's house. Henry's office. If we're going to fight this, we need to understand exactly what we're dealing with. Maya looked at the house that was now legally hers, its Victorian gables sharp against the afternoon sky. And Marcus? Thank you for everything. I couldn't do this alone. You're not alone, he said simply. Eleanor made sure of that. As they drove toward town, Maya found herself thinking about Eleanor's careful planning, her quiet documentation of Victoria's betrayal. Her grandmother knew this day would come, had prepared for it as thoroughly as she'd prepared for everything else in her meticulously organized life. The least Maya could do was honor that preparation by fighting for the truth. Henry Blackwood's law office occupied the second floor of a brick building that had housed legal practices since the 1890s. The narrow stairs creaked under their feet, and the hallways smelled of old paper and leather bindings, scents that Eleanor had always associated with important matters requiring careful attention. Henry's secretary, Mrs. Patterson, had been guarding his appointments for nearly as long as Henry had been practicing law. She looked up from her typewriter, an actual typewriter, Maya noted with amusement, and smiled with genuine warmth. "Maya, dear, how are you managing? And Marcus, good to see you again." "We're managing," Maya replied. "Is Henry available? We have some questions about yesterday's revelations." Mrs. Patterson's expression grew serious. "He's been expecting you. Go right in." Henry's office was a shrine to legal tradition, with floor-to-ceiling law books and framed diplomas dating back to his Harvard graduation in 1979. He looked up from a stack of documents as they entered, his usually neat silver hair showing signs of a sleepless night. "Maya, Marcus, please, sit down." Henry gestured to the leather chairs facing his desk. "I've been going through Eleanor's files since dawn, trying to understand the full scope of what Victoria attempted." Maya settled into the chair she'd occupied as a child when Eleanor had brought her along for will updates after her parents' death. "What did you find?" Henry opened a thick manila folder. "Eleanor was more thorough than I initially realized. She'd been documenting Victoria's behavior for months, and she asked me to do some quiet research into Victoria's financial situation." Marcus leaned forward. "What kind of research?" "Nothing invasive or unethical," Henry clarified quickly, "but Eleanor was concerned about Victoria's sudden interest in liquidating assets, so she asked me to verify some things Victoria had told me about her career prospects." Henry pulled out a printed email exchange. Victoria told Eleanor that her law firm was expanding rapidly, that her partnership was secure, that she was being considered for the firm's executive committee. "But when I made some discreet inquiries through professional contacts—" "You found out she was lying," Maya finished. "Not lying exactly, exaggerating significantly." Henry put on his reading glasses. "Victoria's firm has been struggling since the trust fund investigation Marcus mentioned. They've lost several major clients, and there are rumors about possible layoffs among junior partners." Maya thought about David's admission regarding their financial stress. So Victoria's partnership isn't as secure as she pretended. According to my contact at the New York Bar Association, Victoria has been taking increasingly desperate measures to prove her value to the firm. Expensive client entertainment, aggressive pursuit of high-profile cases, risky investments in the firm's name. Henry closed the folder. Eleanor suspected that Victoria saw her inheritance as a solution to problems she'd created for herself. That explains the timing, Marcus said, making notes. But how did Victoria get access to legal documents sophisticated enough to fool people at first glance? Henry's expression darkened. That's where things become particularly troubling. Eleanor asked me to research document forgery after Victoria's visit in August. She was that suspicious of Victoria's motives. He pulled out another file, this one thinner but somehow more ominous. There's a disbarred attorney in Manhattan named Robert Kellner who's been investigated multiple times for creating fraudulent legal documents. He specializes in estate fraud, wills, trusts, powers of attorney. Maya felt cold despite the office's warmth. You think Victoria went to this man? I think Victoria's law firm has represented clients who were Kellner's victims, Henry said carefully. She would have known about his services from that professional connection. Marcus looked up from his notes. That's not proof, though. Suspicion based on opportunity. No, you're right. But Eleanor asked me to document everything, just in case. Henry opened his desk drawer and withdrew a small digital recorder. This conversation from September 15th, when Victoria called me directly. Henry pressed play and Victoria's voice filled the office, crisp and professional, but with an underlying tension Maya now recognized as desperation. Henry, I've been thinking about grandmother's estate planning. Given her age and the complexity of her assets, wouldn't it make more sense to have her affairs handled by a firm with more resources? My firm could provide comprehensive services, tax planning, asset protection, the works. Henry's voice responded with diplomatic firmness. Eleanor and I have worked together for 30 years, Victoria. She's quite satisfied with our arrangement. But are you really equipped to handle something this substantial? No offense, but this isn't 1990 anymore. Estate law has become incredibly complex. There was a pause before Henry replied, Eleanor's affairs are exactly as complex as she wants them to be, and no more. If she decides she needs different representation, she knows how to reach me. Victoria's voice sharpened. I'm just trying to protect the family's interests. If something happened to you, or if your records were compromised somehow, the whole estate could end up in legal limbo. Henry stopped the recording. That's when I knew Eleanor's suspicions were justified. Victoria was essentially threatening to challenge my competence if I didn't step aside. Maya stared at the recorder. She was planning this months ago. The fraud itself, maybe not, Henry said, planning, but she was definitely planning to control Eleanor's estate one way or another. Henry returned the device to his drawer. Eleanor knew she was going to die, Maya said quietly. Eleanor knew she was 92 years old with a weak heart. She wanted to be prepared for any contingency, including the possibility that Victoria might try to manipulate the situation. Marcus closed his notebook. So what's our next step? We have circumstantial evidence and testimony, but proving Victoria actually forged that will requires more direct evidence, Henry agreed. The document itself is sophisticated enough that it might fool casual observers, but forensic analysis should reveal inconsistencies. Paper stock, ink composition, the printing process used. Maya thought about David's troubled expression the night before. What about David? He seemed genuinely shocked by everything. David Sterling might be our key, Henry said thoughtfully. If Victoria used her home computer or office resources to create the forgery, there would be digital traces, email communications with Kellner, research into will formats, document templates. You're asking Maya to turn her sister's husband into an informant? Marcus observed.
Maya sat up, instantly alert. David, what's wrong? You sound... I found something in Victoria's home office. I can't discuss it over the phone, but God, Maya, I think I've been living with a stranger. 2 hours later, Maya and Marcus were driving south toward New York City, the autumn landscape blurring past the windows of Marcus's truck. David had agreed to meet them at a coffee shop in Midtown, far from his apartment and Victoria's office, somewhere they could talk without risk of interruption. "You realize this could be a trap," Marcus said, navigating the increasing traffic as they approached the city. "Victoria could have put David up to this, trying to get information about our case." Maya had considered the same possibility. "I don't think so. You didn't hear his voice, Marcus. He sounded broken. People can fake being broken. Not David. He's not a good enough actor." Maya stared out at the cityscape rising ahead of them. "Besides, what choice do we have? If David has evidence of Victoria's forgery, we need it." They found David in a corner booth at a busy Starbucks, hunched over a laptop with the desperate focus of a man trying to solve an impossible puzzle. He looked up as they approached, and Maya was shocked by the change in his appearance. The confident investment banker she'd known for 5 years had been replaced by someone who looked like he hadn't slept or shaved in days. "Thank you for coming," David said, closing the laptop carefully. "I wasn't sure you would, after everything." "What did you find?" Maya asked, sliding into the booth across from him. David glanced around the crowded coffee shop, ensuring they couldn't be overheard. "Victoria's been working from home more often lately," said her office was being renovated. "Yesterday morning, after she left for work, I went into her study to look for our tax documents. That's when I found this." He reopened the laptop and turned it toward them. The screen showed a folder titled EH Estate Planning, containing dozens of files with names like Vermont Will Template and Probate Court Requirements. Maya's heart sunk as she scanned the file names. "David, wait, there's more." David clicked on a subfolder labeled Research. It contained web browser history showing searches for document forgery detection, will contest procedures, and most damningly, Robert Kellner Legal Services. Marcus whistled softly. She was researching how to avoid getting caught, even as she was planning the crime? "It gets worse," David said, his voice hollow. He opened an email program and showed them a sent message to an address they didn't recognize. "This is from 3 weeks ago." Maya read the email, her hands growing cold. "We need to move up our timeline. The old woman is getting suspicious and asking too many questions about her existing will. Can you have the documents ready by early October? Payment will be immediate upon successful completion. V." The response, sent the same day, was brief. "Understood. Will require additional fee for rush service, half payment up front." David closed the laptop with shaking hands. "There's more. Bank transfers to an account registered to R. Kellner. $20,000 3 weeks ago, another $20,000 last week." Maya stared at her sister's husband, seeing the complete collapse of a man who'd believed he was married to an ethical person. "David, I'm so sorry." "Don't." His voice was sharp with pain. "Don't apologize for Victoria's choices. I should have seen this coming. The stress, the secrecy, the way she'd been acting since Eleanor got sick." Marcus leaned forward. "What are you going to do with this information?" David was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. "Victoria called me last night from her hotel in Vermont. She wants me to help her contest Henry's will. Says the old man is either confused or part of some conspiracy against her. And I told her I needed time to think about it." David looked directly at Maya. "But I've already made my decision. I can't be party to this anymore. What Victoria did, it's not just fraud. It's a betrayal of everything Eleanor meant to our family." Maya felt a complex mix of relief and sadness. Relief that David was choosing truth over loyalty to his wife. Sadness for the marriage that was dissolving before her eyes. "This evidence," Marcus said carefully, "it could end Victoria's career. Criminal charges, disbarment, probably prison time." "I know." David's voice was steady now, as if he'd moved beyond the shock into acceptance. "But what's the alternative? Let her get away with defrauding Eleanor's estate? Pretend I don't know my wife is a criminal?" Maya reached across the table and touched David's hand. "You don't have to decide everything right now. Why don't you come back to Vermont with us? Stay at Eleanor's house for a few days while you figure out what comes next." "I can't. Victoria's flying back tonight. If I'm not there..." David shook his head. "I need to play this carefully. If she suspects I know about the forgery, she might destroy evidence or disappear entirely." Marcus nodded approvingly. "Smart thinking. Can you copy these files without Victoria knowing?" "Already done." David handed Maya a thumb drive. Everything's on there. The research, the emails, the bank transfers, even some voicemails from Kellner about document specifications. Maya pocketed the drive, feeling its small weight like a stone. What will you tell Victoria? That I need more information before I can support her legal challenge. That I want to review Henry's evidence before making accusations. David managed a bitter smile. She'll believe that. She thinks I'm too weak to act without her approval. As they prepared to leave, David caught Maya's arm. There's something else you should know. Victoria's planning to file an emergency injunction to freeze Eleanor's assets. She has a hearing scheduled for Friday morning. On what grounds? Undue influence. She's claiming Henry manipulated Eleanor into changing her will, that he took advantage of her declining mental state. David's expression was grim. She's going to argue that Eleanor wasn't competent to make legal decisions in her final months. Maya felt anger rise in her chest. Eleanor was sharp as a tack right until the end. Anyone who knew her could testify to that. That's exactly what Victoria's counting on, David said quietly. She's betting that a judge who didn't know Eleanor personally might be swayed by arguments about age-related cognitive decline. The drive back to Vermont passed in tense silence, both Maya and Marcus processing the implications of David's revelations. Victoria wasn't just trying to claim an inheritance. She was preparing to destroy Eleanor's reputation and Henry's professional credibility in the process. We have to stop her, Maya said as they passed the "Welcome to Vermont" sign. We will, Marcus replied. But first, we need to prepare our own case. Henry needs to see this evidence, and we need to gather testimony from everyone who interacted with Eleanor in her final months. Maya thought about Eleanor's sharp wit and caring nature, her continued involvement in the antiques business, and her deep knowledge of family history. The idea that Victoria would paint her as a confused old woman manipulated by her lawyer was almost more offensive than the original fraud. Victoria's made this personal now, Maya said as they turned into Eleanor's driveway. She's not just stealing from the family, she's attacking Eleanor's memory. Marcus parked the truck and turned to face her. Are you ready for what comes next? Because once we present this evidence, there's no going back. Victoria will face serious criminal charges. Maya looked at the house Eleanor entrusted to her care, its windows glowing warm in the autumn twilight. Inside, Henry was waiting with legal documents and strategic plans. Outside, the community Eleanor loved was going about their evening routines, unaware that their beloved matriarch's legacy hung in the balance. Eleanor trusted me to protect what she built, Maya said finally. That includes her reputation, her values, and her faith in justice. As they walked toward the house, Maya felt the weight of the thumb drive in her pocket, small, but containing enough evidence to destroy her sister's life. The battle for Eleanor's legacy was about to begin in earnest, and there would be casualties on both sides before it was over. David Sterling stood in the kitchen of his Manhattan apartment, staring at the coffee machine as it gurgled through its morning routine. 3 days had passed since his meeting with Maya, 3 days of living with the weight of evidence that would destroy his wife's life and career. Victoria moved around their home with the focused energy of someone preparing for battle, making phone calls to lawyers and reviewing documents late into the night. The irony wasn't lost on him that he'd married Victoria partly because of her moral certainty, her unwavering confidence in right and wrong. Now that same certainty had led her to commit crimes that could send her to prison. David, have you seen my Mont Blanc pen, the one Eleanor gave me for passing the bar exam? The casual mention of Eleanor's name made David's stomach clench. Even in the midst of defrauding Eleanor's estate, Victoria still claimed sentimental attachment to Eleanor's gifts. It was a level of cognitive dissonance that David was beginning to understand as fundamental to his wife's character. It's in the drawer of your desk, he called back, his voice carefully neutral. David had been practicing that neutrality for days, perfecting the art of appearing supportive while quietly gathering more evidence of Victoria's deception. The previous evening, while Victoria was on a conference call with her legal team, he'd photographed additional documents in her study, including a handwritten timeline of Eleanor's visits and detailed notes about Henry Blackwood's vulnerabilities. The timer on his phone buzzed, his signal to check Victoria's computer while she was in the shower. David moved quickly to the study, where Victoria's laptop was still logged into her email account. He scrolled through recent messages, looking for anything that might reveal the full scope of her planning. What he found made his hands shake. An email chain with someone identified only as RL contained detailed discussions about creating a convincing narrative around Eleanor's mental decline. The messages outlined a strategy to find medical professionals who would testify about the likelihood of cognitive impairment in elderly patients, regardless of their actual condition. But the final message in the chain made David sit down heavily in Victoria's chair. David doesn't suspect anything, and he won't. He's too trusting and too weak to challenge me, even if he did figure it out. His testimony about Eleanor's apparent confusion during family visits will be crucial to establishing diminished capacity. I can coach him on what to say. David stared at the screen, reading his wife's assessment of his character and her plans to use him as a weapon against Eleanor's memory. The woman he'd...
David set down his coffee cup carefully. Victoria, Eleanor seemed perfectly sharp to me. Even during our last visit, she was telling coherent stories about the antique business and asking detailed questions about our lives. That's selective memory, sweetheart. Think more carefully. Victoria's voice carried the patronizing tone she used when she thought David was missing an obvious point. Remember how she repeated herself during dinner? The way she seemed confused about dates? Her difficulty following complex conversations about legal matters? David did remember Eleanor asking twice about their flight schedule and seeming uncertain about whether a particular antique show was scheduled for November or December. Normal lapses for a 92-year-old woman, but Victoria was spinning them into evidence of incompetence. I'm not comfortable testifying about Eleanor's mental capacity, David said quietly. Victoria's expression shifted, her lawyer instincts recognizing potential opposition. David, this isn't about comfort. This is about justice. Henry Blackwood took advantage of an elderly woman's vulnerability to manipulate her final wishes. If we don't challenge this, Eleanor's true intentions will be ignored. How do you know what Eleanor's true intentions were? The question seemed to catch Victoria off guard. She paused in her preparation, her coffee mug halfway to her lips. What do you mean? I mean, how can you be so certain that the will Henry has is fake and yours is real? What if Eleanor really did want Maya to inherit the estate? Victoria's face went through several expressions before settling on patient condescension. David, sweetheart, think logically. Eleanor raised us both, but I'm the one who succeeded professionally. I'm the one with the education and experience to manage a complex estate. Maya is a small-town art teacher who can barely manage her own finances. Maybe Eleanor valued different qualities than professional success. Such as what? Loyalty. Compassion, the kind of person who visits weekly and listens to old stories and helps with medications. David met his wife's gaze steadily. The kind of person who loved Eleanor for who she was, not what she owned. Victoria's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something cold and calculating underneath. That's a lovely sentiment, David, but that's not how the world works. Eleanor built a substantial estate through hard work and smart decisions. She wouldn't have left it to someone without the capability to preserve and grow it. Or maybe she left it to someone she trusted to honor her values instead of just her assets. The silence stretched between them, tension crackling like electricity. David realized he'd gone too far, revealed too much doubt about Victoria's version of events. David, Victoria said finally, her voice carrying warning, I need you to focus on what's important here. We're fighting for our family's legacy, for justice for Eleanor. I need to know you're with me. David looked at his wife, really looked at her, and saw clearly what Maya had been dealing with their entire lives. Victoria's absolute certainty that her version of truth was the only valid one. Her inability to consider that others might have legitimate perspectives that differed from hers. I'm with you, he said, the lie tasting bitter in his mouth. I want what's best for Eleanor's memory. Victoria smiled, apparently satisfied with his capitulation. Good, pack a bag for the weekend. After we win this hearing, we'll need to start making decisions about the estate. I've already spoken to several real estate agents about listing the property. As Victoria gathered her briefcase and headed for the door, David felt something fundamental shift inside him.
The woman he'd married was gone, or perhaps she'd never existed at all. What remained was someone who saw Eleanor's death as a business opportunity and her husband as a convenient witness to lies. After Victoria left for the airport, David sat in their apartment surrounded by the expensive furniture and artwork they'd accumulated during their marriage, all of it financed with borrowed money, all of it dependent on Victoria's continued success at a law firm that was itself struggling to survive ethical scandals. He pulled out his phone and dialed Maya's number. "Maya, it's David. I need to tell you something important about tomorrow's hearing." "What is it?" David took a deep breath, knowing that what he was about to say would end his marriage and probably destroy the life he'd built with Victoria. "Victoria's planning to use me as a witness to testify that Eleanor was mentally incompetent. She wants me to lie about what I observed during our visits." "David." "I'm not going to do it, Maya. I'm going to tell the truth about Eleanor's mental acuity, even if it destroys Victoria's case." David's voice grew stronger with each word. "And I have evidence. Emails, documents, bank transfers that prove Victoria planned this fraud months in advance." "Are you sure? Once you testify against Victoria, there's no going back." David thought about Eleanor's warm smile, her sharp questions about his work, her obvious love for Maya and concern for the family's future. Then he thought about Victoria's cold calculation, her willingness to destroy anyone who stood between her and Eleanor's inheritance. "I'm sure," he said finally, "Eleanor deserved better than what Victoria's trying to do to her memory. And, Maya, you deserve the inheritance Eleanor chose to give you." As David began packing for Vermont, he felt the weight of his decisions settling over him like a heavy coat. Tomorrow, he would walk into that courtroom and tell the truth about his wife's crimes, knowing it would cost him everything he thought he wanted. But for the first time in weeks, David Sterling felt like he could live with himself. The Chittenden County Probate Court had hosted countless family disputes over the decades, but Judge Margaret Henley had rarely seen a case that drew such community attention. By 8:30 in the morning, the gallery was filled with Eleanor Hartwell's friends, neighbors, and fellow business owners, people who had known the matriarch for decades and wanted to see justice done in her name. Maya sat at the plaintiff's table beside Henry Blackwood, her hands folded in her lap to hide their trembling. Across the aisle, Victoria had positioned herself at the defendant's table with the confident bearing of a woman who'd argued dozens of cases in courtrooms far more prestigious than this one. She wore a navy suit that screamed expensive legal authority, and her makeup was flawless despite the early hour. "All rise for the Honorable Margaret Henley," the bailiff announced. Judge Henley was a woman in her early 60s with steel gray hair and the kind of penetrating gaze that suggested she'd heard every lie attorneys could devise. She settled behind the bench with the efficiency of someone who valued both time and truth. "This is a hearing to determine the validity of competing wills submitted for the estate of Eleanor Margaret Hartwell," Judge Henley began, her voice carrying clearly through the packed courtroom. "Mr. Blackwood, as the attorney presenting the purported authentic will, you may proceed." Henry rose with the deliberate movements of a man who'd practiced law longer than many of the observers had been alive. "Thank you, Your Honor. The evidence will demonstrate that Ms. Hartwell executed her final will and testament in my office on October 15th, witnessed by 2 of my staff members and properly notarized according to Vermont law." He gestured toward Maya. "Ms. Hartwell chose her granddaughter Maya as her primary beneficiary after careful consideration of both young women's characters, their relationships with her, and their capacity to honor her legacy. The competing document presented by Victoria Hartwell Sterling is an elaborate fraud designed to steal an inheritance rightfully belonging to Maya Hartwell." Victoria stood immediately. "Objection, Your Honor. Mr. Blackwood is making accusations without presenting evidence." "This is opening statements, not testimony, Miss Sterling. You'll have your opportunity to respond. Continue, Mr. Blackwood." Henry nodded gratefully. "The evidence will demonstrate that Miss Sterling orchestrated this fraud over months,
researching document forgery techniques, contacting known forgers, and manipulating her grandmother through repeated visits designed to gather information necessary for the deception. He opened his briefcase and withdrew the thumb drive David had provided. We will present digital evidence recovered from Ms. Sterling's personal computer, including email correspondence with document forger Robert Kellner and bank records showing payment of $40,000 for his services. Maya watched Victoria's face carefully, looking for cracks in her composure. Her sister's expression remained professionally neutral, but Maya noticed the slight tightening around her eyes, the way her pen pressed a little harder against her legal pad. Your Honor, Victoria said, rising again, the evidence Mr. Blackwood claims to have was obtained illegally through theft from my private computer and home office. Any such materials should be excluded as inadmissible.ui. Judge Henley consulted her notes. Mr. Blackwood, how was this evidence obtained? Through the voluntary cooperation of Miss Sterling's husband David, who discovered the materials in the course of normal household activities and chose to provide them in the interest of justice. Henry replied smoothly. I'll hear testimony on the admissibility of this evidence before ruling, Judge Henley decided. Mr. Sterling, please take the witness stand. David walked to the witness box, noting his pale complexion but steady gait. He wore a simple gray suit instead.
The courtroom fell silent. Maya saw Victoria's mask slip for just a moment, revealing the desperation and fury beneath her professional composure. No further questions, Victoria said tersely. Judge Henley made notes on her legal pad. I find that Mr. Sterling's testimony regarding his observations of the defendant's computer files is admissible. The evidence was discovered through normal household activities and was provided voluntarily in good faith. Continue with your case, Mr. Blackwood. Henry called Janet Morrison next. Eleanor's neighbor took the stand with the determined bearing of a woman who'd spent 20 years watching over her friend and wouldn't be intimidated by legal proceedings. Mrs. Morrison, please describe Victoria's behavior during her visits to Eleanor Hartwell over the past year. Janet's testimony was devastating in its specificity. She described Victoria's increasing frequency of visits, her focus on Eleanor's financial affairs rather than her health or happiness, and her obvious frustration when Eleanor mentioned consulting with Henry about important decisions. During the August visit I witnessed, Janet said, looking directly at Victoria, she brought papers for Eleanor to sign and became agitated when Eleanor said she wanted time to review them. That's not how a loving granddaughter behaves toward a 92-year-old woman. Victoria's cross-examination was aggressive, but ineffective. Janet had witnessed too much and remembered too clearly for Victoria to discredit her observations. Tommy Hartwell testified next, his 16-year-old honesty cutting through the legal complexity like a knife. He described Victoria's questions about Eleanor's relationship with Henry, her interest in where Eleanor kept important documents, and the way she'd grown impatient when Eleanor wanted to share family stories rather than discuss business matters. Victoria used to love Grandma Eleanor's stories, Tommy said, his voice cracking with emotion. But this year, she'd check her phone or change the subject whenever Grandma started talking about the past. It was like she didn't want to remember that Grandma was a person, not just someone with money. By afternoon, Henry had presented a comprehensive case documenting Victoria's fraud. Digital evidence, witness testimony, and forensic analysis of the forged will all pointed to the same conclusion. Victoria had systematically planned and executed a complex crime against her own grandmother. Victoria's defense was desperate and increasingly erratic. She challenged Henry's competence due to his age, suggested a conspiracy between Maya and the local community, and argued that Eleanor's decision to leave everything to Maya proved she wasn't thinking clearly. Your Honor, Victoria said during her closing argument, my grandmother was a 92-year-old woman who had become isolated and dependent on people who told her what she wanted to hear. Henry Blackwood, took advantage of that isolation to manipulate her into disinheriting her most successful granddaughter in favor of someone who couldn't properly manage a complex estate. But her arguments fell flat in the face of overwhelming evidence. The courtroom had heard Victoria's own recorded voice discussing document forgery, seen her bank transfers to a known criminal, and witnessed testimony from multiple credible sources about Eleanor's mental acuity and Victoria's manipulative behavior. Judge Henley announced that she would render her decision the following morning, and the court adjourned. As people filed out of the courtroom, Maya noticed that most of Eleanor's friends avoided making eye contact with Victoria, their disappointment and disgust evident in their body language. Outside the courthouse, Maya found herself surrounded by community members offering support and expressing their shock at Victoria's actions. But her attention was focused on David, who stood apart from the crowd with the hollow expression of a man who had just destroyed his marriage to do the right thing. "David," Maya said, approaching him carefully, "thank you. I know how hard that was." "It was the right thing to do," David replied quietly. "Eleanor deserved better than what Victoria was trying to do to her memory." As evening fell over the small Vermont town, Maya realized that tomorrow would bring either vindication of Eleanor's wishes or the triumph of Victoria's deception. The battle for Eleanor's legacy had been fought with truth on one side and desperation on the other, and now they could only wait for justice to be served. The courthouse was even more crowded the next morning, word having spread throughout the community about the dramatic testimony from the previous day. Maya arrived early, unable to sleep and unwilling to spend another hour in Eleanor's house, waiting for news that would determine the rest of her life. Victoria sat at her table with rigid composure, but Maya could see the strain in her sister's carefully controlled posture. David was notably absent from the courtroom, an absence that spoke volumes about the state of their marriage. Judge Henley entered at precisely 9 o'clock, carrying a thick folder that presumably contained her decision. The courtroom fell silent as she settled behind the bench, her expression revealing nothing about the ruling she was about to deliver. "This case has presented the court with clear evidence of premeditated fraud. The evidence overwhelmingly demonstrates that Victoria Hartwell Sterling systematically planned and executed a forgery of her grandmother's will using sophisticated criminal resources and manipulating family relationships in pursuit of financial gain." Maya felt her heart hammering in her chest. Beside her, Henry sat with professional calm, but she could see the satisfaction in his weathered features. The evidence recovered from Ms. Sterling's computer, corroborated by bank records and witness testimony, establishes beyond reasonable doubt that she contracted with known document forger Robert Kellner to create a fraudulent will. The forensic analysis of the contested document confirms that it was created using materials and methods inconsistent with legitimate legal practice. Judge Henley's gaze moved to Victoria, who sat frozen in her chair. "Miss Sterling, your actions represent not only criminal fraud, but a profound betrayal of family trust. You exploited your grandmother's love and manipulated your position as family member to commit crimes that strike at the heart of our legal system's integrity. Therefore, I rule that the will presented by Victoria Hartwell Sterling is fraudulent and invalid. The authentic will, executed by Eleanor Hartwell on October 15th, as presented by attorney Henry Blackwood, is hereby admitted to probate." Maya heard gasps and murmurs from the gallery behind her, but the sounds seemed distant and unreal. After days of legal battle, Eleanor's true wishes had finally been validated. But Judge Henley continued, raising her hand for silence. "However, this court's responsibilities extend beyond simply determining the validity of competing documents. Ms. Hartwell's authentic will contains provisions that both parties should understand fully." Henry rose. "Your Honor, with the court's permission, I'd like to read Eleanor Hartwell's personal letter, which was sealed with her will and addressed to both granddaughters." "Proceed, Mr. Blackwood." Henry withdrew an envelope from his briefcase, its aged paper bearing Eleanor's familiar handwriting. Maya noticed that Victoria was finally showing emotion, her professional composure cracking as Henry broke the seal. To my beloved granddaughters, Maya and Victoria, if you are hearing this letter, it means I am gone and my final wishes are being contested. This saddens me more than you can know because it means our family has broken apart in exactly the way I hoped to prevent. Maya felt tears beginning not just for Eleanor's death, but for the profound wisdom her grandmother had shown even in anticipating this moment. Victoria, my dear child, I have watched you struggle with desires that can never be satisfied by material wealth. Your accomplishments in law are remarkable, and I have always been proud of your intelligence and determination, but somewhere along the way, you began to see relationships as transactions, and love as a commodity to be earned through achievement. I have left the bulk of my estate to Maya, not because I love you less, but because Maya has shown me what it means to value people over possessions, relationships over recognition. She visited not because she wanted something from me, but because she genuinely enjoyed my company. She listened to my stories not out of duty, but out of love for our family history. Henry paused, looking up from the letter. However, Mrs. Hartwell did not leave Victoria without provision. Maya's eyes widened in surprise. What do you mean? Henry continued reading. Victoria, I have established a trust fund in your name containing $50,000 to be released only after you have completed 100 hours of community service helping elderly residents in your community. I hope this requirement will help you rediscover the compassion I know exists within your heart. The courtroom buzzed with surprised murmurs. Even in death, Eleanor was trying to teach Victoria a lesson of service and humility. Additionally, Henry continued, raising his hand for silence, I have left instructions for Maya regarding the antique business. If Victoria demonstrates genuine remorse for her actions and commits to rebuilding our family relationships through honest effort, Maya is authorized to offer Victoria a partnership in the business.
Would be the first time Victoria had returned to Vermont since the court hearing, and Maya wasn't certain her sister would accept the tentative olive branch she'd extended. The past 6 months had been difficult for Victoria in ways Maya could only imagine. The criminal charges had resulted in a plea agreement that included restitution, community service, and probation, but avoided prison time. Victoria's law firm had terminated her partnership immediately, and she'd been suspended from practicing law pending a Bar Association review. More devastating than the professional consequences, however, had been the personal ones. David had filed for divorce, their Manhattan apartment had been sold to pay legal fees and restitution, and Victoria had been forced to rebuild her life from nothing, a process that had apparently included genuine reflection on the choices that had led to her downfall. She'll come, Marcus said with quiet confidence. Whatever else Victoria is, she's not a coward, and I think she wants to find a way back to the family. Maya heard a car on the driveway and looked out to see Henry Blackwood emerging from his sedan, moving with the careful deliberation of his 77 years. Behind him came Janet Morrison carrying a covered dish, followed by Tommy Hartwell, now 17, and preparing for his senior year of high school. Over the next hour, Eleanor's house filled with the people who had known and loved her best. The conversation was warm but subdued, everyone aware that they were gathering in the shadow of the previous year's dramatic revelations. At 11 o'clock, just as Maya was beginning to think Victoria wouldn't appear, a rental car pulled into the driveway. Maya watched through the window as her sister emerged, wearing simple jeans and a sweater instead of her usual power suits. Victoria looked thinner than Maya remembered, and there was something different about her demeanor, less aggressive confidence, more cautious humility. Maya met Victoria at the door, and for a moment they simply looked at each other, two sisters separated by months of pain and the weight of betrayed trust. Thank you for inviting me, Victoria said quietly. I wasn't sure you would. I wasn't sure either, Maya admitted, but Eleanor would have wanted you here. They embraced briefly, tentatively, like strangers trying to remember how to be family. Inside, Victoria greeted the assembled guests with obvious discomfort. Several people were polite but cool, making clear that forgiveness, if it came at all, would be earned rather than granted. But Tommy Hartwell surprised everyone by giving Victoria a genuine hug, and Janet Morrison, after a moment's hesitation, offered her condolences on the difficulties of the past year. Victoria, Henry said, approaching her with measured friendliness, I'm glad you could join us. Eleanor always hoped her birthday celebrations would bring the family together. I'm sorry, Henry, Victoria replied, her voice barely above a whisper. For everything. For what I tried to do to you, to Eleanor's memory, to Maya. I know apologies don't undo the damage, but I needed to say it. Henry nodded gravely. Eleanor believed in redemption, Victoria. The question is whether you believe in it for yourself. Maya had planned the gathering to celebrate Eleanor's life rather than relitigate the past, so she guided the conversation toward memories and stories. People shared favorite Eleanor anecdotes, laughed at her gentle humor, and marveled at her wisdom and kindness. Victoria participated cautiously at first, then with growing confidence as she realized no one was going to attack or humiliate her. She shared a memory of Eleanor teaching her to identify different wood grains in antique furniture, a skill that had sparked Victoria's initial interest in law through understanding the importance of authenticity and provenance. Eleanor always said that knowing the real from the fake was essential in antiques and in life, Victoria said, her voice thick with emotion. I wish I had remembered that lesson before I lost my way so completely. As afternoon turned to evening and guests began to leave, Maya found herself alone with Victoria on Eleanor's back porch, watching the sun set over the garden their grandmother had tended for decades. I've been doing the community service Eleanor required for the trust fund, working at a senior center in Boston, helping elderly residents with basic legal issues, nothing complex, just explaining their rights, helping with paperwork. How has that been? Humbling. Eye-opening. Some of these people have been taken advantage of by family members, by lawyers, by people they trusted. Victoria's voice was quiet but steady. I see myself in the predators, and I see Eleanor in the victims. It's been educational. Maya waited, sensing there was more Victoria needed to say. I've been thinking about Eleanor's offer, the possibility of partnership in the business. I don't know if I deserve that opportunity, and I don't know if you'd be comfortable working with me, but I'd like to try, if you're willing. Maya had been expecting this conversation, but she still wasn't sure how she felt about the prospect of working closely with her sister. What would that look like, Victoria? How do I know you've really changed? You don't, Victoria answered honestly. I can tell you that I'm in therapy, that I'm learning to value different things than I used to, that I understand the difference between earning something and being entitled to it. But ultimately, you'll have to judge by my actions over time, not by my words today. They sat in comfortable silence, watching stars appear in the darkening sky. Maya thought about Eleanor's letter, about her grandmother's hope for redemption and family healing. There would be conditions, Maya said finally. You'd start as an employee, not a partner. You'd work regular hours, interact with customers, learn the business from the ground up, and you'd live here, in Eleanor's house, so we could rebuild trust gradually. Victoria's eyes filled with tears. Maya, I don't know what to say. After everything I've done. Eleanor believed people could change. I'm willing to find out if she was right about you. As Victoria's rental car disappeared into the darkness, Maya remained on the porch, thinking about the strange paths that had led to this moment. Eleanor's death had revealed the worst in Victoria, but it also created the possibility for something better to emerge from the ashes of their broken family. The antiques business would continue carrying forward Eleanor's legacy, valuing authenticity and craftsmanship over quick profit. The house would remain a gathering place for family and friends, filled with love and laughter rather than secrets and resentment. And perhaps, with time and patience, and the kind of grace Eleanor always shown, the Hartwell sisters would learn to be family again, not because they were bound by blood, but because they chose to honor the love that had shaped them both. Marcus appeared in the doorway behind her. "How did it go?" "Better than I expected," Maya replied, taking his hand. Eleanor would have been proud. Of Victoria? Of all of us. For choosing hope over hatred, forgiveness over revenge. Maya smiled, feeling Eleanor's presence in the evening breeze that carried the scent of roses from the garden. Inside Eleanor's house, the grandfather clock chimed midnight, marking the end of what would have been Eleanor's birthday and the beginning of whatever came next. The last testament had been read, the battles had been fought, and now came the harder work of living up to the legacy they'd inherited, not just the material wealth, but the wisdom, compassion, and love that Eleanor had spent a lifetime accumulating. The future stretched ahead, uncertain, but filled with possibility, guided by the values of a woman who understood that the greatest gift we can leave behind is not what we own, but who we choose to become.
Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.